was twice as long. So I'm going to hand it over to Ozzy.
Pamela. Good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, it's very good to see all of you, and welcome to our December monthly meeting. And today, with a focus on the Beijing Plus 25 thematic clusters, today we're going to focus on the effects of climate crisis on women. As many of you know, that we are no longer speaking about climate change. The change has happened. We are now speaking about climate crisis. We are in the middle of a climate crisis. We're no longer talking about the future, rather we're talking about now and really mitigating the effects of the climate crisis and coming up with plans immediately to mitigate some of the issues that are affecting us. As primary caregivers, women around the world provide basic needs for survival, health, and well-being. These include building networks of supporting relationships that strengthen our communities. The climate crisis and other environmental destructions directly and disproportionately impact women. I'm also talking about environmental racism here. And the essential work that we do. For example, they threaten sources of food and water and throw into chaos the supportive networks women build. As many of you know, that the majority of the farmers of the world are female. Women and children work on the land, and climate crisis is having a huge effect on the production of food, and of course, bringing about malnutrition, hunger, and further poverty. Since women have less economic status and power than men, climate disasters leave women in worse conditions with bigger challenges and less support with which to recover. Women who face multitude of oppressions, indigenous women, women in the global south, women of color, poor women, women with disabilities, older women, and young women are hit the hardest. According to the UN, 80% of the people displaced by climate change are women, and we're talking about climate refugees here. Yet women's representation is less than 30% in national and global climate negotiation bodies. Women remain insufficiently recognized and involved in environmental policy making and environmental management. This must change as the global community works to achieve environmental sustainability, gender equality, and women's empowerment. Last year, two very important global meetings happened. COP25 was just in Spain. It was supposed to be in Chile, but unfortunately, because of political crisis, it was moved to Spain. And also, in September, we had the UN Climate Action Summit here in New York City, and I know a number of us were participating there. And again, issues of women and how climate crisis is affecting women was central at both these international meetings. And today, I want to thank Pamela, who really put this panel together and has worked very hard in making sure that we bring a group of really wonderful speakers to offer us some more thinking. But I just want to ask each and every one of us to really think about, how is climate crisis affecting you, right? How is it affecting you? I know for me, the moment I made a decision to really throw myself into this issue was when I found out that my beloved nation, Iran, will be a nation with no water in the next 30 years. It will be a nation where big parts of the country will not be habitable, where people are going to have to abandon villages. They're going to have to abandon cities and move and be climate refugees And that's the moment I realized this is my issue, and I'm gonna have to move, and I'm gonna have to really do whatever I can in not only to think about everyone in my country, but in particular think about women who are often left behind in thinking and really planning for any kind of mitigation. So I want you to think about how is this affecting you, right? What's your connection to climate crisis? And secondly, please go back to your organizations. I'm a UN representative of the International Alliance of Women, and I want to ask you to go back to the organizations that you're involved with and ask them what are their policies in relation to climate crisis and women, and how is your organization taking on this issue. Again, I want to thank you very much, and I want to give the mic to my sister, Pamela.
Hello. Thank you for braving the cold to be with us. You can't hear me? Okay, can you hear me now? Great, thank you. Thank you for braving the cold to be with us for this last NGO CSW meeting for the decade. I will be the moderator for today's panel. Joining us today are Her Excellency Penelope Beckles, Ambassador and Permanent Representative of Trinidad and Tobago to the United Nations, Amy Hall, the Vice President of Social Consciousness with Eileen Fisher, Gerke, who is the Assistant UN Representative from UNANIMA International, and Allison Kelly from the ACT Alliance. Can they please come to the podium, or please come to the stage? To reiterate, today's session continues NGO CSW New York's focus on presenting panels on issues supporting the 6 thematic clusters for analyzing the progress of the 25th anniversary of the Beijing Platform for Action at our monthly meetings. This session refers specifically to thematic cluster number 6, environmental conservation, protection, and rehabilitation. Climate change, or cluster, as Ozzy stated, represents the most complex challenge of our time. The distinct impacts of climate change on men and women are exacerbated in settings that are also affected by environmental conflict, political instability, and economic strife. Extreme weather events, such as droughts and floods, have a greater impact on the poor and most vulnerable, who we know are women. Gender inequality limits the resilience and adaptive capacity of women, who are said to account for 70% of the world's poor, families, and communities. And most importantly, gender inequality also restricts us from climate change mitigation. We are pleased that our 4 panelists represent governmental, NGO, and corporate sectors, and that they will discuss the effects of climate change and further discuss the integration of gender considerations in climate policies, plans, and actions for the future. I now ask the Honorable Penelope Beckles if she would give us her remarks.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good afternoon, everyone. Okay, so I know it's a little cold, so that might account for the cold. Good afternoon. So I'll try that again. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Oh, that sounds so much better. You know, normally when you're speaking, you start by saying it's a pleasure to be here. In this cold weather, you know, I could be somewhere on the beach. So, I mean, that's so much better because I was looking at all these faces and I said, I'm going to talk, and I said, wow, why is everybody looking so glum? You know, I was just getting to very, very excited. Okay, so first of all, I want to thank the NGO CSW committee for inviting me to talk about this topic, which is, very dear to my heart, coming from the Caribbean. And on the whole, I know there are a number of NGOs here. I just would like to take the opportunity really to thank you for the work you have been doing at the UN, and ensuring that the voices of the NGO movement is heard. I know you would like it to be heard a lot more, but I have been an ambassador now since 2016, and I have seen for myself the recognition of the important work that you do. So I just wanted to say, don't give up, continue working very hard, and you have a friend here in me trying to do whatever I can do to assist the work that you do. Now I want to confess that I have not been to COP25, but I did go to COP24 in Poland. And that was a bit of a steep learning curve for me because, I'm a lawyer by profession and a politician. And I think it's one of the things that we need to talk about whenever we talk about things that you don't understand how the UN works and why some things take so long to get done. Okay. All right, so I don't speak too loudly, but I'll try a little better. And a lot of it is because your decisions are arrived at by consensus. And that means that it's not a process that some of us think about, which is a democratic process and you vote and what have you. So, sometimes it's important as part of your organizations to examine a bit of the processes which would not necessarily cause you to be sympathetic, but at least you would at least understand that things take a little longer because you have your 193 countries, and in some instances things take a little longer to get to where we want it to be. Okay, so that as a small island developing state, Trinidad and Tobago, together with its Caribbean neighbors, are no strangers to the devastating effects of unmitigated climate change. And I'm sure that I can assume that most of you have been to some part of the Caribbean. Bahamas recently, I'm sure you all saw exactly how awful that hurricane was. Dominica, Antigua, Antigua in the case where one of the islands actually, immediately after the hurricane, no one was actually living on that island. Now, the IPCC's 1.5 degrees centigrade special report found that the effects of human-induced climate change are worse than previously projected, and therefore increases the risk to health, livelihood, human security, and economic growth. And especially for small island economies, climate change is an existential threat. Now, however, these climate change-related risks do not occur in a vacuum. Rather, the far-reaching economic, environmental, and social consequences of climate change serves as a threat multiplier, applying additional strain on limited resources, social and economic pressures, and the adaptive capacity of our fragile ecosystems, all of which lead to scarcity, population displacement, and even conflict. All of these are complex and interrelated causes and consequences of climate change on people, in particular those who are most vulnerable, including our women and girls. Often climate change is seen with the lens of energy and renewable technology, and also as peace and security concern. But critically, climate change is a woman's issue. Women and children can continue to bear the brunt of poverty, and in the same way climate change affects them especially. When access to necessary resources such as water, food, and fuel is limited, women's livelihood and the survival of their families are threatened in the wake of climate-related disasters. The international community resolutely recognizes that climate change is a common concern for humankind, and that its impact on women and men are often differ owing to the historical and current gender inequalities and multidimensional factors, especially in small island developing countries and their local and indigenous communities. Therefore, in the same way that gender empowerment and equality can contribute to economic growth and eradication of poverty, women and girls are critical to addressing climate change. Women are agents of change who must equally be part of the solution towards a sustainable, climate resilient future. Importantly, the Paris Agreement makes a critical link between climate action and gender by recognizing that adaptation and capacity building must be gender responsive, and the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change process recognizes that the full, meaningful, and equal participation and leadership of women in all aspects of national and local level policy and action is vital to achieving our climate goals. On this basis, state parties to the Unf Triple C adopted the Lima Work Program at COP20 on gender and its Gender Action Plan, which underscores the importance of coherence between gender-responsive climate policies and the balanced participation of women and men in the convention process and the provisions of international instruments and outcomes, including CEDAW, the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Certainly, the foundation for a gender perspective entrenched in the UNF Triple C process, not only in integrating gender considerations in the convention work stream, but also encourages state parties to increase the representation and active participation of women on delegations, in training, and in the drafting of legal outcomes. Now, I'm sure you know that sometimes you feel the only time they want to see women at the UN is during CSW. Following up from the United Nations Secretary General Climate Action Summit, it was expected that the momentum of the commitments made in September of this year in New York would have been translated to even more ambitious and political action in the UNF Triple C process and the implementation of the Paris Agreement. This was a lost opportunity to signal, especially to our young people who are striking across the world, a message of earnest intent to increase ambition on mitigation and to limit global warming. Ultimately, we are unable to reach consensus in many important areas, including the requirements for transparency and common timeframes under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, and importantly, capacity building and financing for loss and damage. Notwithstanding this, there was success story amid disappointment. The conference took a decision on a new 5-year gender action plan intended to support the implementation of gender-related decisions and mandates in the UNF Triple C process. The adoption of the Gender Action Plan will build on the progress to achieve the Lima Work Program, enhancing women's access to climate finance and their participation in international climate talks and national climate action. While the adaptation of the Gender Action Plan is currently welcome, it should be noted that some countries still showed some resistance in the plan's negotiations, and this reflects that climate justice continues to be threatened and must be safeguarded for all. So, what are the next steps? There are several areas under the Gender Action Plan, and I wish to highlight a few. First, capacity building and knowledge management, as well as the access to climate finance, is crucial to enhancing the systematic integration of gender consideration into climate policy and action. In particular, there is a need to facilitate outreach and knowledge sharing within and between grassroots women organizations, in particular rural communities and indigenous communities. To achieve and sustain the full, equal, and meaningful participation of women in the UNF Triple C process, we need to promote gender balance and women's leadership at all levels. given the multidimensional nature of climate change and the network of climate-related processes, integration of gender consideration within the work of the Unf Triple C process and bodies, as well as in the national processes and bodies, must be carried out in a coherent manner to ensure consistency across multiple frameworks and other environmental processes. And finally, in that recommendation, improvements are needed, especially in developing countries, to improve monitoring and reporting mechanisms to better track and assess the implementation of gender-related mandates at the national, regional, and global levels. These are critical to advancing coherence between gender considerations of the Paris Agreement and other international frameworks, and the realization of climate justice for the most vulnerable. However, while these steps will achieve considerable progress for women and girls, the failure to advance critical issues such as Article 6, loss and damage, and enhanced ambitions will only serve to undermine integrity of the Paris Agreement at a juncture where our current NDCs are nowhere near enough to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. We must move forward, and continued inaction of these important issues must not become the norm. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for that most informative presentation. At this time, I'd like to ask Allison Kelly if you would not mind staying here because of the light. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. So good afternoon. I'm Allison Kelly, the UN representative for ACT Alliance here. And I'd like to thank Her Excellency because she's actually already introduced a lot of what I'm going to say today. For ACT Alliance, gender equality and climate change are both expressions of structural injustices that cater to the overexploitation of natural resources and human rights abuses. So for our advocacy, while it's imperative that we work for solutions that science dictates we need to avoid global warming beyond 1.5 degrees Celsius, it's equally imperative that we do this with a clear justice lens, one that ensures that the poorest, that the most vulnerable, and those that have least contributed to global warming do not pay the price and have their rights to development actually taken away. Now, there are, of course, multiple arenas to address gender in global advocacy, which I'm going to focus on here. And I'm going to focus quite explicitly on the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Unf Triple C. We'll hear, I think, later about private sector and some of the other potential arenas. And I've also thought that maybe most of us here might be more gender activists than climate experts. So I'll first talk very briefly about the UNF Triple C process and the extent to which gender is incorporated into the proceedings, with apologies to those who are already very well versed in this area, and then perhaps suggest some entry points to integrate climate and gender advocacy across our work. So as we know, the UNF Triple C is the international environmental treaty developed at the Rio Earth Summit in 1992. It's non-binding and it has no enforcement mechanisms, but aims to stabilize the greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference in the climate system. So by now, over the years, it's become a highly complex and technical process with different work streams, multiple subsidiary bodies, various meeting streams throughout the years, with the primary decision-making forum being the annual COP, usually in December. And in a nutshell, I think we've seen with the conclusion of the most recent COP25 in Madrid last week, it's absolutely clear that the lack of political will, particularly by a number of richer countries, now hinders global progress to tackle the core issues of the process, including reducing and ending greenhouse gas emissions, assisting less developed countries to adapt to climate change, as was mentioned, addressing loss and damage, where the effects of climate change are already too severe or come too quickly even to be able to be mitigated by adaptation measures, and crucially, to ensure sufficient financial flows. Next year, if we're speaking about advocacy in the midst of the multiple UN anniversaries that I think we're all familiar with, 2020 is also highly significant for global climate advocacy, as it marks 5 years since the Paris Agreement was adopted. And next year, 2020, is when we should have mobilized $100 billion a year to help developing countries mitigate and build resilience to climate change. 2020 is when all countries are expected to renew their NDCs, their nationally determined contributions, with increased ambition to drive down global emissions and to undertake a global stocktake of the collective measures. The indications are not good. So far, so gender blind, and inevitably, as has already been mentioned, the negative consequences of climate change and of this lack of political action will be most felt by those who did little to cause it, especially women in the developing world and indigenous peoples. I think all of us are well aware here in this audience of the structural and social factors that contribute to gender equalities across political, economic, and social life. And then from our experience as humanitarian and development organizations, we know that these very same factors that keep women disproportionately living in poverty are the same that make them more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. All these issues are well known and evidence-based, and I'm not actually going to speak to them here. But it then goes without saying that climate policy and action, which fails to recognize that women and men traditionally play different roles in the household and in informal and formal economy, and policies which focus on the productive and formal sectors of the economy, will inevitably downplay women's needs and interests. So then we need to assess, within the global climate structure, what is the potential to drive gender-sensitive policy. The unanimous adoption last week, as was mentioned, of this revised gender action plan at COP25 was seen perhaps as one of the few high points in an otherwise rather disappointing session. I'll come back to the gender plan later, but in my view, I think the Unf Triple C has been shockingly slow at addressing gender issues. It was the only convention in 1992 with no gender language at all. It took until 2001 even to recognize gender equality as a guiding element. It recognized the need to promote gender balance and increase women's participation only in 2012. It adopted the Lima Work Program on Gender in 2014, and it finally agreed its first gender plan of action at the end of 2016. And to me, even against very low expectations in a number of processes, this seems quite late and slow. So it's small wonder then that the starting point for gender inclusion has been quite low. The gender balance of membership of the 6 major committees in the process, 4 of them have well under 25% women representation. And similarly, without specific gender language, we've seen that only a handful of decisions made under the main themes address or reference gender, meaning that there are very few entry points for gender-related action or for gender reporting and disaggregated data. Moreover, the decisions that do reference gender are also skewed. So many of those decisions, most would relate to adaptation, and there are actually only a very few handful in areas such as mitigation, technology, finance, and capacity development. And it's not just in the process that gender has been so underplayed. Of the actual delegates to the COP last year, 38% were women, with the number of women delegates always lower at the decision-making COP than at the non-decision-making mid-year meetings. And tellingly, of 190 nationally determined contributions for emission reduction, only 64, about a third, actually include any reference to gender or women. Of those, 34 refer to women as a vulnerable group, but only 6 refer to women as drivers of change, and 15 to women as decision makers. And here I just need to also acknowledge the great work that the Women's Environment and Development Organization does in monitoring, analyzing, compiling these figures, and I really recommend that you look at their gender tracker on their website, because they keep this very up to date. So anyway, but a very low starting point. But having said that, there is now some progress. So as we've heard, the first Gender Action Plan of 2017 to 19 includes the 5 priority areas that were mentioned: capacity building, gender balance, participation in women's leadership, coherence, gender responsive implementation, and monitoring and reporting. The GAP was reviewed this year in a synthesis report on the integration of gender considerations into national climate policy and action and the implementation of the work plan. And it's interesting reading. And I must say that I don't usually say that about UN reports, but it is actually interesting reading. The report covers where the plan has helped member states to take gender-sensitive action. It records good examples of capacity development initiatives, of resources, and so on. And it includes a lot of recommendations for improvements to the plan and to its implementation. However, this synthesis review only received 31 submissions. Now this includes the EU and the US on behalf of 3 other countries, so it's slightly higher, but that's a very low number of countries who even bothered to report on how they had engaged with the Gender Action Plan. So the new Gender Action Plan will now run till 2024 with the same priorities and with a greater focus on gender-just implementation and climate solutions. The key improvements are that it takes into account human rights. It talks about just transition, so marrying that science and justice elements, and specifically acknowledges the challenges that Indigenous peoples face. I think that all of us here know, as with the Beijing Platform for Action or the ICPD Cairo Declaration, these remain mere documents without concrete action. So what are the entry points for gender advocacy to strengthen the gender sensitivity of climate action? And I would just note that we have a very strong movement of civil society groups, of faith-based organizations, even the women and gender constituency mobilized around the Unf Triple C process with lots of specialized knowledge and expertise, and that will continue. And I don't think that I'm here suggesting that we all become those kind of climate experts. But what I want to challenge us today to consider is how we, perhaps more as feminists and as gender activists, one, can better incorporate greater climate-aware messaging into our own specific areas of gender advocacy, and 2, how can we support advocacy for gender-sensitive climate action through our work? So I'll throw out a few ideas based loosely around ACT policy demands to the last COP, but it will take a lot more further work by all of us to develop that kind of coherent gender and climate messaging around the entry points that I think we now need. So the entry points first, as we've said, we have the new Gender Action Plan. ACT has been calling on all states to implement the activities under the GAP to strengthen gender aspects of climate-related activities globally. But if even the existence of the plan is little known outside the climate arena, it's all too easy for governments simply to ignore it where there's no demand on account for how they're implementing it. So how do we raise awareness and promote the new Gender Action Plan as another tool we have? We need to raise a stronger voice to ensure that states see the plan as important and take action to implement it. And certainly we need to see that the next review will have more than 31 submissions. Secondly, I would ask, how do we hold the Gender Action Plan up as an important platform on which to engage at a national level? So for example, one specific deliverable in the plan is engagement of women's groups and national women and gender institutions in developing and implementing climate policies, plans, strategies, and actions. It's not asking for climate people, it's asking for women's groups, it's asking for gender institutions. So how do we help our constituents and our networks to become aware of this, to link with their own national climate and other activists so that their gender expertise can actually be brought into those processes? third area is that 2020 is the year that the states must develop their revised nationally determined contributions, their NDCs. And the implementation guidelines for those revisions call on them to be an inclusive and participative process that engages with local communities and Indigenous people in a gender-responsive manner. So what can we do to ensure states do engage with people, and how do we support our partners to be heard in this? And I realize I do take this with a bit of pinch of salt, given our experiences of inclusive processes in relation to voluntary national reviews for the high-level political forum, or even the Beijing Plus 25 national reviews. But I think that that doesn't mean that we shouldn't still continue to push for the right to be consulted and the right to be heard. The last one I'll focus on really is then that the guidelines, these implementation guidelines, also call for gender-responsive adaptation actions and for the inclusion of traditional knowledge of Indigenous peoples, and local knowledge systems related to adaptation in their adaptation communications, and to report on this. So this goes well beyond seeing Indigenous peoples simply as those particularly affected, or even recognizing their role in environmental stewardship. So what can we do to ensure that that traditional knowledge, including that of women, is central to adaptation plans? And beyond the climate arena, how do we help to make that link to national development plans and to the SDGs to include that traditional knowledge? There are many other areas that have been raised here, including financing for women's participation, which echo many of the processes we know, for example, funding for inclusion of women in peace processes and so on. So all of these become very important. So I'll just conclude by saying these are some very rough ideas, but and maybe some of you are saying, you know, what does this kind of have to do with me? I'm not a climate person, but as has already been stressed earlier, we're now in a time of climate emergency, and there is no area of activity, whether we work with widows to ending child marriage and gender-based violence, whether we work on women's economic empowerment, or the sexual health and reproductive rights of adolescents. There's no area of work that is not now affected by climate change in some way. And given that urgency for climate change, and given such slow and paltry progress that we've seen towards gender equality, the opportunity to mutually strengthen and reinforce our climate and gender advocacy will be hard, but it's an opportunity that we can't afford to miss. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think it's interesting to know we have two questions. First, how does climate change affect you? And second, what can we do? And I hope that when we leave here today, those questions will resonate. And at this time, I'd like for Molly to please address me.
Thank you for all coming out in the cold. I know personally for me it was a struggle this morning. But also thank you for the opportunity to be on this wonderful panel. And today I'll be talking about climate from two slightly different perspectives. The first is my personal experience with the contemporary issues and fears of suburban and rural women across the Republic of Vanuatu. And the second is the climate crisis in the context of homelessness and displacement. So Vanuatu is an island nation made up of over 80 individual islands located in the South Pacific Ocean. Like many other small developing island states in the region, Vanuatu is subject to social, environmental and economic adversities and inequalities. These, combined with its physical exposure, lead it to its extreme vulnerability to climate change and the climate crisis. The Nivan people are having to continuously adapt or deal with the ramifications, which include, but are definitely not limited to, changing precipitation and drought in West Umbai, rising sea levels in Torres, and extreme weather events such as cyclones that periodically batter the entire country. Having spent several years visiting the same parts of Vanuatu, it is evident that climate change is causing a number of negative physical ramifications, such as environmental degradation and land loss. However, it unfortunately doesn't stop here. It also puts significant social and economic strain on the communities and the resources they need to thrive. One example of this is the inability to access medical assistance during extreme weather events. This is something I personally became accustomed to while living in West Sunbay during the wet season. Unfortunately, climate change is not just affecting access. It's having detrimental effects on a number of different industries and traditional livelihoods. This is especially true for vulnerable subgroups, including women, children, the elderly, and poverty-stricken communities that rely heavily on the informal sector. As I've been told time and time again by my friends across the islands, food production, especially in rural areas, is becoming really hard. Traditional methods of agriculture are becoming unreliable and seasons becoming unpredictable. This inherently causes a lack of food security and in many cases a lack of livelihood. One example of this was during the Cyclone Pan in 2015, where the entirety of Port Vila, the country's capital, largest handicraft market, was completely wiped out due to a massive storm surge. This left countless women unemployed and unable to make an income. In 2017, myself and a number of women who were actively involved in local women's groups facilitated workshops across 3 islands. The one-day workshops were spent speaking about the issues women face, the things they value most, and how the SDGs connect these. Among many interesting findings was that the majority of women who participated in the workshop identified climate change or things directly related to climate change as a major issue in their lives. Many women also noted they expected it to get worse in the near future and that they feel it'll be something they must adapt to if they are to continue living in their current dwellings and communities. Among these stories of climate struggles was that of my dear friend Mei Lin, who among many adversities is a sole provider for 7 children and a victim of family violence. Mei Lin is a woman of many talents, including weaving and creating delicious meals from island flavours. In order to pay her children's school fees, when I met her in 2013, she was beginning to set up what could only be described as a makeshift roadside stall to sell her goods. Over the years, her stall slowly grew, and by 2016, she was almost getting enough money to send all 7 of her children to school. Unfortunately, by 2017, Mei Lin and her family were forced to relocate due to rising sea levels and the increased impact of storm surges. At the workshops, she told her sad story and how she not only lost her home, community and land, but also the small market house that she had built. It was her absolute pride and joy. Unfortunately, Mei Lin's story of becoming homeless and facing displacement due to climatic effects is not unique. Our focus at UNANIMA International is family homelessness. Homelessness is on the rise globally, and climate change is a significant driver of this. As we know, climate change is increasing the frequency and intensity of extreme weather events such as heat waves, wildfires, droughts, floods, tropical cyclones, which in aggregating water management problems, reducing agriculture production and food security, and increasing health risks, as well as damaging critical infrastructure and interrupting human access to basic services such as water and sanitation, education, energy, and transport globally. Unlike its ramifications, the climate crisis is a global issue that leaves no one behind, affecting people and the planet in every country, no matter its location or economic status, in a diverse number of ways. At UNANIMA International, we are currently undertaking research into family homelessness, specifically around women and children and trauma. Since its launch in 2018, in conjunction with quantitative research, we have put significant effort into bringing the voices of women and children, especially girls, who are experiencing or have experienced homelessness to the UN. Time and time again, we hear the voices of women and children that have fallen victim to the devastating effects of climate change and the way in which it exacerbates inequalities. One such voice is that of Mary, and I'm really sorry I'm about to butcher the names of a few cities and towns. Mary was born in 1978 in Kalakuma in northwestern Kenya, in the arid and semi-arid lands of the Turkana County. This is a drought-prone region that normally goes through regular cycles of drought and flooding. With climate change, these events have become more frequent and more severe. If the rain fails, crops can't grow, especially in a hard and unproductive land of the region. No water for livestock has had a devastating impact on both livestock and the families that depend on them. Mary was orphaned at age 8. Due to food insecurities and extreme family poverty, at the age of 10, she and two of her brothers migrated to the streets of Eldoret in search of sustenance and some kind of life. Today, Mary has 6 children of her own, 2 of which are currently living in an orphanage. Unfortunately, her experience of homelessness due to climate change has followed her throughout her life cycle, and she still spends most of her days and many of her nights on the street. Unfortunately, when we see the effects of the climate crisis, we see people in already vulnerable situations left even further behind. As stated by Oxfam, when natural disaster strikes, they hit poor communities first and worst. Since women make up an estimated 70% of those living in poverty, under the poverty line, we're the most likely to bear the heaviest burdens. At the same time, women are often left out of the conversations about adapting to climate change, even though they are sometimes in the best position to provide solutions. While I wasn't able to attend COP25, a standout moment for me was hearing a young Ugandan climate activist speaking to a CNN reporter. She expressed a thought that many of us here today have probably felt. When you talk to people who are causing this and they are not listening, it feels like you are wasting your time. Touching the hearts of many, she then went on to shed a cold, hard reality of the climate crisis. I am the voice of dying children, displaced women, and people suffering at the hands of the climate crisis created by rich countries. She finished her interview by pleading conference members and willing delegates to recognise the scale of the environmental emergency. What decision makers, especially those in heavy emitting countries such as Australia, must realise is that it isn't just affecting the poor, it is also affecting the rich. And in time, they too will be faced with the economic and social burdens that climate change already reaps on a number of nations globally. Currently in Australia, where I'm from, we are facing one of the worst bushfire seasons in history. Wildfires have been burning uncontrollably and uncharacteristically early since August. There's no denying the severity of these is linked to climate change, and it is having a very real effect on the people being displaced by them. In 2013, a dear friend of mine, Beth, was forced to leave her home after uncontrollable bushfires burned her family's home and land, as well as their family's business and hence their income. At the age of 16, after losing her home and family livelihood, Beth was left with little choice but to look for employment. Unable to access appropriate benefits in a timely manner, she became an early school leaver in order to pay her rent so she could avoid dipping into experiencing homelessness again. As depicted in these experiences, environmental stresses and displacement have a particularly devastating impact on women and girls. When climate and financial stresses occur, irrespective of the regional, economic, or social context, women are inherently left more vulnerable than their male counterparts. The communities I've worked with and the women we advocate for are no exception to this. Common themes and issues such as lack of security, violence against women, difficulty paying school fees, lack of shelter and food are all often amplified in the face of climate change, and in many places lead to displacement or homelessness. These are all issues that need to be addressed if we are to achieve the 2030 agenda. While the experiences I've shared today might seem bleak, and the outcomes of COP at times may make us want to cry, I think it is so important to hold on and encourage the hope and the change so many women, girls and men are standing up for globally. Looking around this room, there are so many people working and advocating for change. Globally, we see countless individuals and groups coming together to work hard, lead initiatives, and adapt to the best of their ability to climate change and the adversities that it brings with it. While progress is slow, changes are occurring, and social movements are beginning to impact social norms. In the best cases, they are impacting political will. As one of my interviewees in Vanuatu had said, our home and our islands are changing, but so are we. We are the women of Vanuatu, and we are strong and standing up together. I think it's voices and sentiments like this that we must bring to the UN, and we need to show this ideology and strength at the global scale. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Molly. So at this time, I have one more question. And that question is, what can corporations or the private sector do to help? What would be good practices? I won't say best practices, but I would say good practices for corporate responsibility. And with that question, I'll ask Amy Hall, who represents Eileen Fisher, to speak with us.
Thank you very much. I'm getting some slides connected. Is it okay if I stand up since I have energy? There we go. It's stuck. Okay, I'm good. While I'm getting some slides connected, I don't come from the UN community, so I'm from private sector. I'm going to share with you Eileen Fisher's approach and response to this crisis, which is a perfect evolution of where we've come from as a company and what our values are as a company. And before I get into that, I thought I might just ask how many people here are not familiar with Eileen Fisher. It's okay to raise your hand. Good, okay, there's a few. Just a real brief overview, just to, while we're waiting for that. We are a women's clothing company. We're based here in New York. We have 60 stores of our own worldwide, mostly in the US, but also Canada and the UK. Wow, it's amazing that you did that without a cable. I am so impressed. And we're private. Just to give you a quick picture, this is a picture of Eileen, who is still she's our founder and our leader. We've been around for 35 years as a company. Eileen is a very well-known advocate for women, and not only do we make clothes for women, but Eileen has for a long time been very generous in her own philanthropy and through the company towards women's issues. It's a picture, a current ad picture. We do have, just to continue the thread about where we're coming from, we have 4 simple truths as a company. Eileen is a pioneer, design is simple, fabric is central, sustainability is woven in, and women are at the heart of all we do. And it's those last 2 that I think are really significant here. We were founded with a commitment to natural fibers, and over the years we've evolved to take a very serious deep dive into the origins of our clothing back to the farm. And if you pair that with women being at the heart of all we do, from the perspective of our customers, our employees, we're 85% women, the people in our supply chain, we're about 80% women in the supply chain, as well as our community members, this is a significant stakeholder group for us. And just over a year ago, at one of our company meetings, Eileen, completely unplanned, but I captured it, of course, because it was so important, said, we have a huge opportunity to create a really powerful brand. between our great design work, our sustainability work, and our women's work. It's just a matter of how we weave it all together. And, you know, we've had philanthropically this commitment to women. We've had, on the product side, this commitment to sustainability. It just makes sense to bring it together for deeper commitment, deeper impact. Another way to look at it, this is a quick, very simple timeline, but these 3 rows here represent the grant making that we've had over the years, all the way through 2018. Women-owned business grant, Women's and Girls Self-Image Grant, and Activating Leadership for Women and Girls. And simultaneous, we've had our long-term commitments to natural fibers, timeless design, and human rights. And more recently, our Vision 2020 commitment to environmental sustainability and human well-being. So this is just, again, another way to talk about these parallel commitments that until this year never merged. So, you know, what we're trying to do here is find that intersection that, you know, where that blends what's important to us as a company, what the world looks to for us on leadership, and what is the most important need that's been unmet in the world. We were deeply inspired by the publication of Drawdown, the most comprehensive plan ever proposed to reverse global warming. Came out in 2017, and you know, I wouldn't call it a book that you would read cover to cover, but what really struck us was in the back, it listed the 80 actions that civil society should take to combat global warming, and numbers, I think, 6 and 7 were educating women and girls in family planning, and we couldn't believe it, that those would be such significant influences in combating global warming. And then you add that with women as smallholder farmers, number 62, and they add up to the most powerful and most significant actions we can take as a society. So that got us thinking. And we set out on a listening journey. So that was in spring of 2017, and for the subsequent year and a half, we decided to learn more about this. And we went and interviewed a whole bunch of experts at these organizations. I'm sure many of them are familiar to you. Some were prior grantees of ours, and some were new to us, but we did our homework. We actually wanted to interview UN Women, but we couldn't get to the right person in time, in the time frame that we were trying to do this. We also did a lot of reading, so we read all of these reports that are listed up here. Many of them are from some of those same organizations. And we were really struck by a bunch of themes that we've already heard about today, so I probably don't really need to repeat them, but the idea that women are most adversely impacted by climate change and are the indispensable actors and leaders of effective solutions, that women make up 80% of climate refugees, that if we give women what they need, in terms of this bottom quote here, if women have the same farming inputs, they farm as productively, if not more so, and can improve yields and prevent deforestation. It's a matter of giving women the tools to do what they already innately know how to do so well. And finally, the one at the very top there, only 0.2% of foundation funding focuses explicitly on women and the environment. There's a huge gap in funding. We've already learned today about the need. Where's the money to make all of this happen? So we created a new vision. We established a vision: planetary balance and health through inclusive, equitable, and sustainable systems for all people. We developed our own strategy, which is about advancing women and girls as leaders in the well-being of our planet. And when we say women and girls, we talk about all female identifying individuals. And we identified 3 leverage points, which I was so relieved to hear all of these mentioned today. I can't tell you how reassuring this is. And by the way, this is the first time we've talked about this publicly. You guys are the first to hear about this, other than those who have already applied to the grant. We've never actually made a presentation about this. So very reassuring to know that we may be on the right track. So we identified these 3 leverage points: engaging women in the sustainable economy, increasing women's participation in decision-making, and training women in climate change, adaptation, mitigation, and advocacy. So those 3 leverage points became the 3 grant-making areas that we put forth, which we introduced this year. So here's a screenshot taken a couple days ago from our website. We have now a grant program that we call Supporting Women in Environmental Justice. And we launched it in the spring of 2019 and have made our first grants, which were just announced on Giving Tuesday a few weeks ago. So the first one went to Alaska Community Action on Toxics, which supported Indigenous women who are influencing global policy, making the critical connection between climate change and public health. And I'm just noting the area of the grant program that this really fell into, which was the training women piece. We have the Clio Institute, which is giving 200 women in Miami-Dade County in Florida, which is a huge, hugely at risk to the climate crisis. Giving them a crash course on climate science, civics, and public speaking, and providing financial, emotional, and leadership skills to help them deal with Miami's vulnerability to storms. International Rivers, which is this particular picture, I think was taken in Nepal, if I'm not mistaken, but it brings women together from around the world and recognizes their unique role as river stewards, and helps them build skills around activism and conduct research to help protect rivers from damming and pollution. The Louisiana Bucket Brigade, this is right here in our own country in Louisiana. We forget that sometimes in this country there are women who are very vulnerable, and these particular women were supported to help them learn how to advocate for and protest and create very convincing arguments to keep petrochemicals out of their neighborhoods. There've been a lot of, and this is in the Mississippi River, St. James Parish area of Louisiana. So decision-making and climate change mitigation. The Pachamama Alliance, helping the indigenous women in the Ecuadorian rainforest build sustainable economic alternatives to oil, mining, and lumber. And in this case, it's about organic vanilla farming. And 2 more. This is We Can, the Women's Earth and Climate Action Network, supporting their new narratives and Women of the Forest programs to help build climate advocacy skills and to care for rainforests in the Amazon, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and Alaska. And finally, We Do, Women's Environment and Development Organization, providing women with skills and knowledge to change the financial system and secure funding for gender-just, community-based climate solutions. So those are the 7 organizations that we supported this year through this particular grant program. And we're going to be reintroducing the same grant program, no changes, in 2020. So for those of you who are interested, this is not an ad, but I figure I might as well just tell you about it. Applications open in April. We do all the ruminating and reviewing in the summer months into September. This is an employee-run committee in our company. We make the decisions by the end of September, create stories for our website and our publicity, and announce everything in November on Giving Tuesday.
What are the range of your grants?
The grants, it's a total amount of $200,000. So this year we gave 7 grants, so they were about $30,000 each. And what's next for us? This is just the beginning. We don't want to keep this siloed just to grant making. We're trying to continue to find ways to build these principles into our business practices. We think about our supply chain, going all the way down to the agricultural level. We are involved in regenerative agriculture and a lot of agricultural programs, as well as our artisan programs, but anywhere in our supply chain, looking to see where these values can be brought to life. And we're thinking also about how do we actually know if we're having impact? What's the measurable change, measurable difference that this, that our involvement can make, whether it's through grant making or something else. And we're also involved in policy, so if there are significant new policy opportunities that anybody would like us to get involved in and have a voice in, we might be interested. You just let us know, and that's how to reach me. And that's our story.
I'd like to thank our 4 panelists, and I would like for you to give them a rousing applause. It's now time for our Q&A. Are there questions? And we'll take 3. Sandy?
Okay, thank you. Just a brief note here. As you were speaking, I received, okay, thank you. Let me introduce myself. Sandy Hecker, Young Global Leadership Foundation, have been engaged in environmental activity for decades. As you were speaking, this article just came in from the Atlantic. History's largest mining operation is about to begin. It's underwater, and the consequences are unimaginable. I advise people, please read it. It is, I was been with the NGO, mining group, and this is something that I will be informing them. It is just incredible, this article. Please read. Thank you.
Sheila.
Oh, boy. What is this? Climate Change 202, right? Yes. Thank you so much for this awesome presentation. I'm going to ask a question, and maybe because I'm coming from the UN. When we talk about climate change, global warming, or whatever it's called between Europe and the US, we talk about women at the table, women in leadership, and the whole burden of whether it's food security, climate change, or whatever it is, the burden is on our shoulders. Why? I'd like Ambassador Beckles to also respond to that specifically. And I say that because Resolution 1325, I was on the original authorship of that resolution. And people believe, and I hear people talking about 1325, women, peace, and security all the time, and thinking that it relates only to peacekeeping, peace, and security. No. One of the things why it worked in peacekeeping was because true contributing countries were getting $1 million from the United Nations to ensure that women were part of peacekeeping. So countries like Jordan, for instance, and Guinea, that never had women in their peacekeeping forces, have to now bring women to the table in these areas. What about the men in these things? We are the mothers, right, of all these men that are, let me use a very bad word, nastying of the world, right? And the education system seems to need to be skewed towards, from kindergarten. When I was in school in Jamaica, as a baby girl, 3 and 4, I was learning about the ocean because I was born right on the ocean. Why is it this burden on the backs of women all the time? And every year we come, for the last 50 years, 70 years, and we go over this. One last thing for the ambassador is this. You talked about the difficulty in getting things done because of the different countries that have to sign on, ratify, or whatever it is that we do. We used to have these bracketed, everything was bracketed. Would you kind of expound on that a little? Is it because of the language? Because sometimes some people don't understand. I might get it. Is it because of cultural norms? Or what is it that caused this?
Thank you, Sheila. And one more. Yes, Judy?
I'm Judy Curry-Ansky from the International Association for Applied Psychology. This is a great panel. And here at the UN, we know that policy goes together with programs and also research. So I love hearing about all the policy that's been done, and in fact, I was one of the co-authors of a new policy about the first time the American Public Health Association has now adopted, as of last month, a policy about mental health and climate change, and in it was gender differences. So that's very major. My point and question to the panel is that in doing that, for 2 years, we had to cull all the research and look for the citations, and it was difficult to find some really scientific studies and research that proved the effects of climate change that were inequality for women. So does the panel know anything about that? Because we can talk about it, but we need to cite it in order to base the policy.
Thank you. So we have 3 questions. One is about the underwater mining. The second is, it was directed directly to the ambassador. And then we have a question about scientific research and citations where we can gather that information. So if someone wants to jump in.
Okay, so you talked about the burden is on our shoulders, and about the role of men. I believe that one of the areas we don't do enough is lobbying. Okay, one of the areas we don't focus enough on is lobbying the men that support women. I think there are a lot of men that support women, and we don't target them enough. I don't know if I'm seeing one lone man in the audience, but I think we should celebrate him. Okay. It might appear to be simple, but we need to celebrate those who support us. Sometimes they're in the minority and they're very powerful. Sometimes we focus a lot on the fact that in the leadership, it's mainly men, and women are in the minority. But sometimes the men who sit there, sorry to say, some of them support the woman more than the women support the woman. I know I can get in trouble for saying that. So we need to deal with that. I mean, we have at the UN that you've never had a female Secretary General. Next year we celebrate 75 years, 75th anniversary of the UN, and you've only had 5 women leading. And we can go on and on about the issue of the role of women in leadership and how do we increase, how do we bring women at the table. So when we talk about the gender perspective and how do we, the gender policies, what exactly do we do? Because we know that, I mean, we talk about Beijing next year, 25 years, and we're going to reflect on the improvements, and why is it taking so long, even for some of the issues you talk about. We don't have enough time today, but I think a lot of you know much more than I do why we're taking that long. The other thing I want to talk about is the issue of economic empowerment, which is so related to the issue of climate change and many other things. I mean, when you look at women only owning 20% of the land, and you look at women in business, how many Ellen Fishers are there to really do what Ellen Fisher is doing? How many women in business to take the decision to help women? I mean, there are a lot of uphill tasks that we have, but the truth is that there's a lot of work to do, and I really would like us to focus a lot more on the issue of women in finance and women in empowerment, because I think that's where a lot of the problems is. And the last one for me about technology, I mean, again, it's related to finance. If you look at the percentage of women in technology, all over the world, it's extremely small. So when you think about climate research and the change and climate justice and climate finance and all of those things, I mean, I really believe if women were much more involved in research as it relates to climate, a lot of what we were discussing, we would not have to discuss.
I just wanted to address the mental health and climate data issue of the last question. I think, although this is a hard kind of subject to broach, there are creative ways of getting around it. I know one approach that we have taken is looking at different vulnerability kind of scales within our countries that we're specifically researching on homelessness, and doing regression analysis and social kind of economics towards that. I think looking at it in that type of way is good because it does kind of show the economic burden or the economic strain not addressing mental health is having, and then kind of playing with the drivers in the regression can give solid results. But I think it is thinking about it creatively and kind of going at it from elements like homelessness that you may not have originally thought of that does already have significant data.
The question about the data, I would encourage you to reach out to Global Green Grants as one organization. They are actually convening foundations to take a closer look at this intersection of women and climate justice, women and climate in general, and really have made a commitment themselves that they have a lot of data. And also, I think someone earlier referenced We Do, women's economic development organization, yeah, and We Can. I think they all have excellent data on their websites.
Thank you. Well, I think we have room for one more set of 3 questions.
Hi, I have a question for Amy. This more comes from the perspective of the consumer and less from the perspective of NGO representation. But I often think that we, just on an individual level, we vote with our dollars and what we buy and purchase. So when I look at purchasing from companies that I really believe in the private sector, I always look for companies like Eileen Fisher, but often just as a young person or maybe with someone that doesn't have a lot of disposable income, feel a bit priced out of that. So do you have any thoughts on advice for people on, or what would you say to people who often don't feel that they can have access
Thank you.
to that?
Another question, please.
Over here.
Hi, I am Teresa Blumenstein. I work with the NGO Committee on Migration and a subgroup within that that's focused on climate displacement, of whom there are many members here today. And I wanted to return with a slightly different angle to a question about data. In our advocacy, we find that we often come up against the problem of fairly insufficient data to illustrate the extent to which climate change and environmental degradation are forcing people to move from their homes, largely because most of the movement happens internally within a country's borders, but also significant numbers across borders. And so I think one of the serious barriers to our moving forward with legitimate protections for people displaced by climate is having access to that data. And so I wanted to ask the ambassador in particular, but anybody who wants to comment, particularly in Trinidad and Tobago, how is data collection, is there any data being collected to link the phenomena of environmental degradation and migration? And also in your experience, what has the conversation been among governments about capacity to collect that data, willingness? And since we're having a gender-specific discussion also, does that conversation also include gender disaggregation of the data? Thanks.
Thank you. And one more. Right here.
Yes, good afternoon. I've attended a lot of discussions on this climate change. But what I want to understand is, I haven't heard it, are we preparing people for emergency disaster? And that's so important in the climate change aspect with everything that's going on, that people have to move from areas to areas, that it's important to have their data collected on a UBS or something, just having all of their documents and then even having some parts of their clothing and change of clothing and some type of food to carry them over is just as important. So I haven't heard us preparing. We need the seat at the table. Yes, the women need the seat at the table, but then we also need to prepare families for this type of events that's gonna happen and moving them towards emergency preparedness. And I need to know where are we gonna go on that?
Okay, so we have 3 questions. One specifically on the economics of supporting socially conscious retailers. Another on data and how is data collected by island states such as Trinidad. And then the third, are we preparing people for disasters, emergency disasters? So who wants to?
So related to the cost, the price of clothing, again, I don't want to make this into an ad for our company. It's true, our clothing is expensive by many standards. I like to say that if you were to purchase an iPhone for $1,000, and you might be able to buy 4 or 5 pieces in our store for $1,000, and hopefully you would take as good care of them as you would your iPhone, right? And they would be thought of as investments. So if we shift our concept of consumerism from quick small purchases to investments, long-term investments that last a long time, which also benefits the environment, that's one way to look at it. But another way to look at it is to buy used and vintage. We resell our own clothing. We collect it and resell it if it's in perfect condition, and otherwise we make it into other things and sell those items as well. So I think there are ways into product. More and more brands are reselling or collecting and reselling their own products. And just to think about maybe how much clothing, this is a little oxymoron, but how much clothing do we actually need? So just buying, the 1 or 2 pieces you love rather than the 10 or 12 you might really want.
I can just go to the preparing question. I'll perhaps revert here more to humanitarian and development perspective than an advocacy perspective in terms of how we're preparing people. And while I think some of our talks spoke a lot about mitigation and about the policies and that, actually there's a lot of work that is going on in what we call disaster risk reduction and also in building resilience, and that's exactly to prepare people, to give them different mechanisms at a community level, at a household level, sometimes beyond, that can actually withstand the next hurricane or the next bad weather or whatever. And so I think that there are, this is a very, very big sort of area of work. But if we were now to put my advocacy hat back on again, similarly that we know that sort of $1 in prevention is $8 worth of gain. We're not yet seeing that in the funding streams for much of this work. So I think the need to actually prepare so that people perhaps don't have to move, but if they do have to move, they can move in a more managed way. We just need more investment in that as well. So I'll leave it at that.
But it doesn't take, I'm so sorry, it doesn't take as much investment. It takes the educating of everyone across the world. Like, just put a t-shirt, a sock, and another pair of sneakers and pack that in the bag just so that you'll have a change of clothing. In the event everything is wiped out. I don't understand California. They have fires every year. And how having people prepared to be ready to run out when that whole fire situation is 3 miles in your backyard. Pick up that emergency to go bag and leave. It's like you're restarting all over again. And it's so hard in these indigenous countries. It's like, wow, I went and, what were those called, the slum dwellers while we were by the highway jam? Yeah. And to see that, it was like, to see that, it's like, wow, slum dwelling is throughout the world, because it's right here in New York City. It's right here in New York. The mayor just got on the news. He wanted to give this big, what he's gonna do for homelessness and all of that. But it's around the world that even if people were just taught at these local food pantries around the world, they come, they do bartering at the tables and stuff like that. She built her own restaurant at the table to like say, hey, let's put a t-shirt in the bag, let's put a pair of socks, let's put that copy of the birth certificate, the copy of whatever identifying information away. And that's just not for the United States. That's emergency preparedness around the world. That it doesn't take much money. An ounce of prevention beats a pound of cure. So if you don't have the dollar, like let's just think along that manner and having that seat at the table. Women always need a seat at the table.
Okay, so just very quickly, because I know we're running out of time. So there are two things. We're going back to the whole issue of the early warning systems. I mean, we're talking for different types of disasters, fires, earthquakes, volcanoes, hurricanes. I mean, depending on where you are in the world, you may have, very modern systems of communication, so you can have early warning systems. For a lot of developing countries, smaller islands, we just haven't reached there. So that you have to think of your own communities, because sometimes we don't always need to have somebody to come from somewhere else to tell us what we need to do. So even as we speak today, sometimes in smaller communities, things can happen. I mean, I can share with you, I'm also chair of UNCLOS, and last year, we looked at ocean governance, and I said to them that in my country, in a smaller community, they are able to figure out when the weather is changing by the movement of insects, ants. And some people find that, but the point is that in your own communities, there are cultural things, there are things that happen. And I can also share with you that I think it was in 2005, I'm not sure, I might be wrong, when there was Sandy in the Caribbean, that even though they got the warning, nobody took it on. And it was very, very devastating. I mean, you had waves as much as 30 feet. So that, your point about education is important, and that's the link with the climate change, because it's changing, so you just can't tell. Okay, and even in Bahamas and in Antigua and Barbuda, some people didn't leave. Some people just don't want to leave their homes. So, we don't have time, but we understand it's complex, but we need to talk about it, and those who have actually been through it, like my friend here that went to Vanuatu, you need to really share with them, because sometimes it's only the people who have been through the experience can really warn you and say, listen, this is serious, you have to leave. Okay, and the last thing about data collection, I talked a while ago about the issue of capacity building and report writing, which is linked to the issue of data. And I'm talking about my own country. Some countries have done very well in data collection. They have spent a lot of money in developing capacity building, training, and they do have the very most modern method of data collection. In many small islands, that is not there. We do have a central statistical office, and yes, we collect data. Some of it is not gender disaggregated, some of it is not gender sensitive, but as you have your voluntary national reviews, which country reports on from time to time. We are due to report next year for the first time. You do have a system from organizations like UNECLAP, UNDP, and many others who are really helping with the issue of data collection and modernization of data.
So we have a comment from BK Woods. She would like to share, far, far away on the periphery of this women's circle in America, I want to tell you that not only is this forum inspiring and educational, but for me and other American women, it helps fold us into another inaccessible, distant hope. And we have somebody, Denise Sisler-Barandon, I'm sorry if I'm not saying that right. She says she agrees, and she has a question. So what are the next steps for this forum? Will there be continued discussion on these specific topics going forward?
On this topic?
Yes.
Well, I'm not sure. I know that we have already planned the schedule for this year, and that is up until the summer. We're going to be covering the 6 thematic clusters of Region 25. So this one was on the 6th one, which was on the environment. Last time, I forget what it was, but we've covered a few. Violence against women. We did peace and security. The next one is going to be on, I forget the topic. And so I don't think we'll cover climate this time around up until June. For sure, it's not in the calendar because we have so many other topics. Yeah, that's all I can say about that. Yes. Oh, and the thematic working groups. Yes.
What I want to say is that just 2 things if you want to get yourselves educated. One was the book that you mentioned, Drawdowns. You can get it online on Amazon, I just checked. It is an amazing book on what you can do. The second one is a book called Extreme Cities. And if you want to know what about New York City and the climate crisis, it's called Extreme Cities, the Peril and Promise of Urban Life in the Age of Climate Crisis. It's an amazing analysis. The author is Ashley Dawson. And if you're giving holiday presents, why don't you give these books to your friends or to yourself to get yourself educated, both about New York City, where most of us live, but also about what you can do. And Drawdowns is amazing. And thank you for mentioning that book.
Right. Thank you all for being with us today. This concludes our session. We hope that you have a happy and healthy holiday and a glorious 2020. Goodbye.
Thank you.